Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Jay Isaac, Blackburn Primary Care in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Today is April 1st, April Fool's Day, 2020. And as we get alarming news from around the world, I think the total worldwide is over 870,000. And the U.S. death toll is over 4,000, tracking towards 200,000 by the end of the month. If things don't change. With all of this ominous news, I thought I'd take a different perspective today. And rather than focusing on health, I'd like to do a little bit of education on pandemics. So, what is a pandemic? Well, essentially, it's any disease that has crossed many boundaries, that knows no nationality or culture, that does not have any regard to geography. So the most common pandemic that we as a people are aware of are influenza pandemics. In fact, we get influenzas every year. So although the death rate is, in the US alone, it averages something like north of 30,000, it doesn't really grab our attention. And personally, I would blame the news medias for that, for not really paying attention to these pandemics, the common pandemics. However, hopefully they'll catch on. But pandemics have been with us for thousands of years. I mean, we all know about Black Death or the plague that wiped out half of Europe in the 14th century. Influenza has been with us for probably 500 years, at least since the 1500s, when cities were beginning to sort of populate Europe and the world, and travel was more worldwide, with the Portuguese and the Spanish and everyone else. So every 40 years or so, there's a major shift of the influenza genome, and there's a worldwide pandemic that kills a lot more people than usual. And since the 1500s, I think there have been over 14 major pandemics. Of course, the ones we're familiar with are things like the 1918 pandemic and more recently the 2009 pandemic. Now, for the young people who think that this is an old person's disease, 1918 and 2009 killed a lot of young people. So pandemics are everybody's problem. So where do these things come from? Well, I've been reading a book. It's called Spillover by David Quammen. It was published, I think, in 2012. It looks like this. I know. It's a horrifying picture of a monkey. I don't know what kind of monkey. But anyway, good book. He sort of predicted this whole COVID-19 pandemic. And what does he talk about? Well, mainly that what we're dealing with is zoonosis. So zoonosis is when infections cross species. Okay, so COVID, for example, the SARS-CoV-2 virus comes from bats and perhaps went to pangolins and then to us. But what you have to realize is we're all animals. We belong to the animal kingdom. We share a lot of genetics. So it's not surprising. What we have to understand is the conditions that lead to this. Now, the current pandemic, COVID-19, apparently began in Wuhan, China, at wet markets. What are wet markets? Wet markets are where live and dead animals of all sorts are sold. And they're, generally speaking, overcrowded. So you have animal cages on top of each other. So you have dead and dying animals secreting onto animals below. So these, of course, are natural breeding grounds. But anywhere where there's overcrowding of animals, viruses can jump from, animal to animal. So it's overcrowded, right? And it acts like a genetic laboratory for viruses that can kind of exchange genetic material, and the strongest survive or the fittest survive, and so the virulence increases. It's selection pressures. So the worst stuff happens in these pressure cookers. And then naturally, the people handling it who are close to it, these are often the first people that come down with this stuff. And obviously, later on, we'll talk about this, but these are the people we should really be closely monitoring, right? But as it were, should we have these kind of conditions? So as I said, today's April Fool's Day. We're playing the fool. We messed with nature and got bit. So I believe that there ought to be worldwide changes to reduce the loss of life, wrecked economies, national securities of countries around the world. So what should we do? Well, firstly, I think there should be greater surveillance. We understand where these things come from. So why not have greater oversight of the places that produce the environment for these kind of, science labs of nature? But even more importantly, why do we have wet markets? Now, in China, you could say, oh, well, it's cultural. But do we need to keep cultural traditions that hurt people, whether nationally or internationally? I mean, in India, there was this practice called sati, where when a man died, you threw his living widow onto his funeral pyre. Was that a cultural, tradition worth keeping? No. What if there were cultural traditions where you had child sacrifice? So culture is not enough of an excuse. What about places like Africa where there's nothing else to eat? You gotta have markets where maybe people hunt things and bring them into these markets, right? Well, obviously that's another problem. We have to, take care of one another around the world. It's not just, someone else's problem. Because if it's someone else's problem, one day it's going to be your problem. So we have to pay attention to poverty. So to me, I think the important things are, first and foremost, get rid of wet markets. Pay attention to things like poultry farms, swine, farms. Monitor these places, for sanitation and to make sure that they're being conducted humanely. As a species, one of our hallmarks is a sense of ethic, of right and wrong, morality, and frankly, it is wrong to treat animals the way we do, to treat nature the way we do. So we have to change business as we currently practice it. We need to change overcrowding. Ever since the time of Greece, Egypt, Greece, Rome, there were plagues because of overcrowding. We have to figure out the overcrowding problem. There has to be transparency. Any country that is covering up what could potentially affect the entire world is practicing some form of bioterrorism and ought to be sanctioned. So there should be a way to monitor worldwide these things. We have monitoring systems for things like earthquakes around the world and tsunamis. So since this poses an existential threat to humans, these things should be monitored as well. I also think that there should be greater understanding of one another as a common species, our cultural aspects, our religious beliefs or non-beliefs. There should be tolerance. There should be greater tolerance, but with firm boundaries about what's okay and what's not. Okay? Finally, I hope we don't have another April Fools like this, where we're the fool, where we monkeyed with nature. We need to change our ways. This is not the end of us. One of the greatest traits of humanity is that we rise to challenges. There may be greater existential threats like an asteroid or a super volcano or something like that. That obviously there are people above my pay grade who think about those things and how to solve them. But this sort of thing should never happen again. That's just my opinion. It's a perspective. And a promise that I'll try not to be as dour in future videos. But I want you to be educated, consider things, have a broader worldview. And then, of course, be safe and be well. Take care.